70,000 white South Africans are now willing to leave their homeland, seeking refuge in the United States under an executive order from U.S. President Donald Trump. The offer, which grants refugee status to Afrikaners, a white minority group descended from Dutch and French colonial settlers, has ignited a fierce global debate. Trump claims that the South African government, led by the black majority, is engaging in unjust racial discrimination against this community, particularly through policies like land reform and affirmative action.
Now, in the backdrop of diplomatic tensions between the US and South Africa, Elon Musk has once again accused the South African government of racial discrimination. Musk accused the South African government of, quote, promoting white genocide.
As US-South Africa ties hit to rock bottom over land reforms, US President Donald Trump has an offer for white South Africans. Trump wants to give them refugee status in the US, as he believes that they are the victims of unjust laws back home. While the leading groups representing white South Africans have refused the offer, the idea has definitely turned heads. Nearly 70,000 South Africans have shown interest in Trump's plan.
But the question remains, are these 70,000 people being oppressed? Or are they simply no longer being treated as the privileged masters of the land, a legacy of the apartheid system? Is the real issue the loss of power rather than the injustice of their treatment? Let's find out. In February 2025, U.S. President Donald Trump made headlines around the world with a bold and controversial executive order aimed at South Africa. The order halted U.S. financial aid to the country, accusing its black-led government of discriminating against the white Afrikaner minority. This move was more than just a policy decision. It was a geopolitical gesture that set the stage for a global debate on racial dynamics, colonial histories, and the role of Western powers in shaping the future of post-apartheid South Africa. Trump's executive order offered refugee status to Afrikaners, descendants of Dutch and French colonial settlers, claiming they were victims of unjust racial discrimination under the current government. This declaration was not without its critics. Many saw it as an attempt to intervene in South Africa's internal affairs, particularly at a time when the country was grappling with policies aimed at redressing apartheid-era inequalities. Trump's rhetoric, shaped by his previous statements on racial and immigration issues, painted a picture of a South Africa in crisis, where white Afrikaners were increasingly under threat from the very government that had been elected to lead a post-apartheid nation. The executive order prioritized Afrikaners, offering them a pathway to resettlement in the U.S. and framing them as victims in need of protection. However, the timing of Trump's move was not incidental. South Africa had long been the subject of international scrutiny, especially regarding its land reform policies, which sought to address the deep racial disparities in land ownership. These policies were viewed by many as a direct attack on the economic status of white landowners, including Afrikaners, who still held the majority of the country's fertile land. In the years leading up to Trump's executive order, tensions between the South African government and Western nations had been building over these issues. Trump's decision to use the Afrikaner issue as a platform for action was, in part, a response to his broader agenda of challenging global narratives about racial and immigration policy. But was the plight of Afrikaners truly as dire as Trump claimed? Or were these accusations of systemic oppression based on a narrative that ignored the complexities of post-apartheid South Africa? Trump's framing of the issue aligned with a larger right-wing narrative, which painted South Africa's land reform and affirmative action policies as discriminatory against white South Africans. He criticized the policies as anti-white measures, using the threat of violence against Afrikaner farmers as a central point in his argument. However, the South African government consistently rejected these claims, labeling them as misinformed and politically motivated. President Cyril Ramaphosa and other government officials swiftly condemned the executive order, calling it a direct attack on South Africa's sovereignty. Ramaphosa insisted that the country's policies were not only lawful, but were part of a broader strategy to heal the divisions left by apartheid. His administration had long defended the necessity of land reform, aiming to redress the imbalances created by apartheid-era land ownership laws, which saw 73% of the land controlled by the white minority. Ramaphosa argued that South Africa's land reform program was an effort to address these historic inequities, not an attack on any specific group. In the wake of Trump's order, a complex narrative began to emerge, one where claims of persecution were intertwined with questions about racial dynamics in post-apartheid South Africa. Some Afrikaners began to see the U.S. offer as a lifeline, while others rejected it, choosing to remain in South Africa and fight for their future within the country. For them, the offer was an insult, a reflection of a world that misunderstood the struggles of those living within South Africa's changing landscape. Many of these Afrikaners felt that they were being unfairly painted as the villains in a story that they believed they had no part in writing. The debate over whether or not Afrikaners were truly facing systemic persecution quickly became entangled with larger issues of race, power, and historical injustice. To some, the offer of resettlement in the U.S. symbolized a global tendency to focus on the struggles of white South Africans while overlooking the decades of systemic discrimination faced by Black South Africans. For the South African government, the international attention on the plight of Afrikaners felt like a diversion from the hard work it had done to build a more equitable society, one that, despite its challenges, was undeniably better than the years of apartheid. As Trump's order set the stage for deeper international scrutiny, it also highlighted a growing rift between South Africa and the Western world. The political and economic tensions between the two continued to widen, with the global community divided over how best to support South Africa's ongoing transformation. While the U.S. pushed for the protection of white South Africans, the South African government doubled down on its commitment to the policies that were driving its economic and social reforms. But is what South Africa doing wrong? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. In the wake of apartheid's dismantling, South Africa faced an immense task: how to build a new democratic society from the ruins of institutionalized racism and segregation. Nelson Mandela's vision for a rainbow nation set the tone for this transformation, one that sought to embrace diversity and encourage healing across the racial divide. Yet, nearly 3 decades after apartheid officially ended, the narrative around South Africa's progress remains polarized. The country's efforts to create a fairer society have been overshadowed by conflicting accounts of what is happening on the ground. Accounts that are often shaped by political ideologies, both within and outside the country. The government's post-apartheid policies, which include affirmative action programs like Black Economic Empowerment (BE) and efforts to reform land ownership, have been crucial in the fight against the inequalities that apartheid left behind. These initiatives were designed to create a more inclusive society by opening up access to opportunities for Black South Africans who had been systematically excluded from economic and social advancement under apartheid. While the policies were aimed at redressing historical imbalances, they have been met with resistance from various sectors of the population, especially the white Afrikaner community, which perceives them as a direct threat to their social and economic standing. For Afrikaners, the shift from a system that favored them to one that prioritizes Black South Africans has felt like a profound loss, not only of privilege, but of identity. The generational connection that many Afrikaners have to the land and their status in South African society has made the transition to a more equal society deeply personal. And while the government insists that these measures are necessary for the country's long-term health, some Afrikaners feel that they are being unfairly punished for the crimes of their ancestors. The ongoing tension between these contrasting perceptions of the past, one that seeks to preserve the old order and the other that aims to dismantle the structures of privilege, has created a national stalemate, preventing true unity from taking root. Yet despite these tensions, South Africa's government remains committed to its vision of reconciliation. Under the leadership of President Cyril Ramaphosa, the government has consistently advocated for policies aimed at building an inclusive future. Ramaphosa has framed the issues of land reform, affirmative action, and economic empowerment not as means of retribution, but as necessary steps to right the wrongs of a past that saw Black South Africans deprived of basic human rights. The government's stance is that to achieve true national healing, there must be a conscious and deliberate effort to ensure that the wounds inflicted by apartheid are not simply acknowledged, but actively addressed through policy. One of the primary tools in this process is the Land Reform Initiative. By focusing on the redistribution of land, historically a symbol of white control, the government hopes to offer Black South Africans the means to assert their independence and build economic security. While land reform remains a contentious issue, it is seen by many as an essential step toward bridging the economic divide between Black and white South Africans. However, for those in the Afrikaner community, the fear of land expropriation without compensation has created a sense of betrayal. For them, land is not just a commodity, it is part of their history, their culture, and their way of life. The prospect of losing it, particularly in a manner that is seen as unfair, has led to widespread anxiety and resentment. Despite the government's efforts to balance the scales of history, some Afrikaners view these policies as a personal assault on their livelihoods. Many of them see themselves as caught in the middle of a battle they didn't start. They acknowledge the injustices of apartheid, but argue that the current policies go too far in punishing a group that was also a victim of the system. This sense of being unfairly targeted has been exacerbated by the growing rhetoric from international figures, particularly Donald Trump and Elon Musk, who have painted a picture of South Africa as a nation in turmoil, where white South Africans are systematically oppressed. Their voices have added fuel to the fire, further polarizing the debate and making it harder for the government to maintain the moral high ground in the eyes of some international audiences. However, this portrayal misses a key aspect of South Africa's ongoing struggle: the complexities of racial reconciliation. Yes, there are challenges, and yes, there are frustrations, but there is also undeniable progress. South Africa is a country that is constantly negotiating the tensions between past injustices and future possibilities. The country's embrace of democracy, its commitment to the rule of law, and its focus on rebuilding the economy to benefit all citizens, regardless of race, should not be dismissed as failures, but as steps toward healing. While no one can deny the deep economic disparities that persist, the government's resolve to address them through policies that promote inclusivity rather than division should be seen as a positive force in shaping the country's future. Despite the criticisms from certain corners, the government's insistence on reconciliation has led to tangible successes. The growth of the Black middle class, the increasing representation of Black South Africans in business and politics, and the expansion of social services to historically underserved communities are all signs that the country's policies are having an impact. These changes are not always immediate, and the process of transformation is undoubtedly slow, but the trajectory is clear. South Africa is moving toward a more inclusive society. For Afrikaners, the challenge lies not in fleeing or abandoning the country, but in engaging with it and contributing to its future. The real question for South Africa is not whether the policies are perfect, but whether they can lead to a society where all citizens, regardless of race or background, can find their place. In the end, the story of South Africa's path to reconciliation is one of struggle, but also one of hope. A nation that continues to learn from its past, engage with its differences, and push forward in search of a truly unified future. The journey is far from complete, but the destination is clear: a South Africa that can heal, evolve, and ultimately thrive together. As the controversies surrounding South Africa's land reform policies and the refugee offer to Afrikaners unfolded, the global geopolitical landscape shifted, with international figures and institutions weighing in on the debate. The issue of race, land redistribution, and the rights of South Africa's white minority became a flashpoint for larger conversations about colonial history, the legacies of apartheid, and the role of Western powers in shaping the future of nations emerging from colonial oppression. In this complex web of international interests, South Africa found itself not only defending its sovereignty, but also navigating the often conflicting pressures of external influence, diplomatic relationships, and its desire to carve out an independent path forward. The arrival of Donald Trump's executive order was a clear indication of how geopolitical tensions could quickly become entangled with domestic policies. While Trump's decision to halt U.S. financial aid and offer asylum to Afrikaners was positioned as an act of humanitarian concern, many in South Africa saw it as a thinly veiled attempt to interfere in the country's internal affairs. The narrative of anti-white discrimination, pushed by Trump and other foreign figures like Elon Musk, ignored the broader context of South Africa's struggles. For the government, this narrative felt like a betrayal, one that not only mischaracterized the reality on the ground, but also undermined the hard work the country had done to heal from its apartheid past. The international backlash to South Africa's land reform efforts wasn't just limited to the U.S. Other Western countries and international organizations expressed concerns about the potential for economic destabilization. Critics argued that land expropriation without compensation could have catastrophic consequences for the country's agricultural sector, ultimately undermining South Africa's standing as one of the most developed economies on the African continent. These voices were loudest in the global media, with the narrative often dominated by fears that land redistribution would trigger a Zimbabwe-style crisis, where a poorly managed land reform policy had led to economic collapse. Yet, this analysis failed to account for the nuanced reality of South Africa's situation. Yes, the country's agricultural sector faces challenges, including high crime rates and a lack of infrastructure in some rural areas, but these problems are not the result of land reform alone. The historical imbalances created by apartheid, where the majority black population was systematically excluded from land ownership and economic opportunity, require more than just economic policy adjustments. They require structural change, and the government's attempt to tackle these issues should not be seen as a political gambit, but as a moral imperative. For many African leaders, South Africa's land reform policies were a symbol of hope and resilience. They represented an attempt to undo centuries of oppression and create a more just society. However, the vocal opposition from Western nations, particularly the US and the UK, only served to amplify the perception that these countries were more concerned about protecting white interests than supporting genuine racial reconciliation. In this context, the debate over land reform in South Africa became part of a larger conversation about the role of the West in Africa's development. It raised difficult questions about the lingering effects of colonialism and how Western nations continue to exert influence over African nations under the guise of aid and diplomacy. At the heart of this international backlash was a deeply rooted tension between the global North and South. Western powers, many of which had historically been complicit in the exploitation of African resources and labor, often found themselves in the uncomfortable position of defending the rights of minorities, even as they ignored the broader historical injustices that had shaped the current realities. In many ways, the West's insistence on framing the debate in terms of anti-white policies or reverse discrimination revealed a profound disconnect with the lived experiences of the majority black population in South Africa, who viewed land reform and other affirmative action measures as necessary to rectify centuries of racial injustice. South Africa's diplomatic stance was one of defiance, but it was also one of pragmatism. Ramaphosa's administration recognized the need for international support, particularly in areas like trade, foreign investment, and climate change, but it also understood that South Africa could not afford to be overly dependent on foreign powers. The country's path forward required a balancing act, embracing international partnerships when they aligned with South Africa's interests, but resisting outside interference when it undermined the nation's sovereignty and its efforts to build a fairer society. In this context, the international criticism of South Africa's land reform policies began to feel like part of a broader geopolitical maneuver aimed at preserving the status quo. By targeting South Africa's land reforms, Western powers, especially those with historical ties to the country, could maintain their grip on a global order that prioritized economic stability over social justice. This geopolitical struggle, however, was not just about protecting white South Africans, it was about maintaining control over the global narrative. The refusal to accept South Africa's right to determine its future reflected a larger trend in which former colonial powers sought to shape the policies of newly independent nations in Africa, even when those policies were aimed at redressing the injustices of the past. For South Africa, this international backlash underscored the country's need to remain firm in its commitment to its vision. While international voices continued to criticize the government's efforts, Ramaphosa and his administration maintained that South Africa's political and economic policies must reflect the values and needs of its people. The global community's concerns about land reform and economic stability were valid, but should not overshadow the country's right to pursue a just and equitable future. As a leader in the global South, South Africa was determined to show that its nation-building project was rooted in the values of justice and equality, not the preservation of colonial legacies. One of the significant elements of this debate was the growing recognition among African countries that the future of the continent could not be dictated by the whims of Western powers. African nations were beginning to assert their sovereignty with greater confidence, standing firm on issues related to land reform, economic justice, and the redistribution of resources. South Africa's fight for land reform was, in many ways, a microcosm of the broader struggles for autonomy that were playing out across the continent. As African nations sought to decolonize their economies and political systems, they found themselves not only battling internal forces of inequality, but also confronting the lingering effects of external interventionism. As this international dialogue unfolded, South Africa remained resolute in its pursuit of a path forward that was true to its history and its people. The country's land reform policies and its broader efforts at reconciliation were not just about resolving past wrongs, but building a future that could honor the sacrifices of those who had fought for a more just and equal society. In this context, South Africa's resistance to external pressure became a defining moment in the country's ongoing struggle for self-determination. Do you think South Africa needs to stand firm, or should they back down? Let us know in the comment section. Will disappointing Trump be better than disappointing Africans? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.